Somewhere, quietly, without any announcement, without any grand apology arriving to make it official, a shift occurred in how they understand everything that happened between you. The story they told themselves for so long, the one where your needs were too much, your feelings too intense, your desire for closeness somehow unreasonable, has started collapsing under the weight of its own inconsistency. And whether or not they ever say it directly, whether or not you ever receive the validation you deserved from the very beginning, something inside them now knows what you always knew, quietly, painfully, in the moments when their behavior made you question your own sanity. You were never the problem. Let's talk about exactly how that realization forms, why it takes so long to arrive, and what it actually means for you now that it finally has. Let's begin with the story that likely existed for a long time, the story where your reactions somehow caused their withdrawal, where your need for reassurance somehow justified their distance, where being told you were too sensitive, too needy, too much, felt increasingly plausible the more it got repeated. This story did not develop by accident. Avoidant defense systems often require exactly this kind of narrative in order to function smoothly, a reframing that transforms their own difficulty tolerating closeness into evidence of your excessive demand for it. This reframing serves an important psychological purpose for them, protecting their self-image as someone who simply values independence, rather than forcing them to confront a more uncomfortable truth, that genuine intimacy itself triggers something they have not yet learned how to tolerate. Let's talk about what it costs you to live inside someone else's inaccurate narrative about your own character, because this cost deserves direct, honest acknowledgement. Being repeatedly told, whether explicitly or through subtle implication, that your normal, reasonable needs for connection and consistency represent some kind of excessive demand gradually erodes your ability to trust your own perception of what healthy relationships actually require. You may have started shrinking your requests, minimizing your own hurt, apologizing preemptively for feelings that never should have required an apology in the first place. This shrinking was never really about becoming a better partner. It was about surviving a narrative that consistently located the problem inside you, rather than inside a dynamic that required participation and accountability from both people involved. Let's talk about what actually shifts when this narrative finally begins to crack, because understanding the mechanism here helps explain why this realization, when it eventually arrives, often takes considerably longer than seems reasonable given how clearly true it should have been from the start. Avoidant defense systems are remarkably resilient, built and reinforced over considerable time, sometimes decades, protecting against a threat that feels genuinely dangerous, even when that danger exists primarily in old, outdated psychological territory, rather than in present reality. Cracking this narrative requires more than simply hearing your perspective once. It typically requires repeated evidence, evidence that eventually becomes impossible to reconcile with the comfortable story that located all the difficulty within you, rather than within their own patterns. Let's talk about what this evidence often looks like, because it rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. It accumulates instead through smaller, cumulative observations. Perhaps they notice similar patterns emerging in subsequent relationships, discovering that someone entirely different from you produces the same withdrawal, the same discomfort with closeness, the same eventual retreat that they had previously attributed entirely to your specific personality or your specific needs. This repetition, occurring with someone who bears no resemblance to you whatsoever, becomes difficult evidence to ignore, gradually revealing that the common denominator across these patterns was never actually the partner. It was always their own relationship to intimacy itself. Let's talk about the specific role time plays in this realization, because time alone, separate from any external evidence, often provides its own kind of clarity that immediate proximity to the relationship never allowed. Distance creates perspective, and perspective often reveals patterns that were invisible while still embedded inside the daily texture of the relationship itself. Looking back from sufficient distance, without the immediate pressure of managing ongoing closeness, sometimes allows an avoidant person to finally see clearly what they could not see while still defending against the vulnerability that closeness required. That your requests were reasonable, that your hurt was legitimate, that the distance was theirs to own, rather than something you provoked through excessive need. Let's talk about therapy and self-reflection, because for some people, this realization develops specifically through deliberate internal work, rather than simply through the passage of time or through repeated patterns in subsequent relationships. Genuine therapeutic exploration of attachment patterns often involves confronting exactly the kind of narrative distortion we have been discussing. Learning to recognize how avoidant defenses systematically misattribute internal discomfort onto external partners. When this kind of work genuinely occurs, the realization that a former partner was never actually the problem often arrives with considerable clarity, accompanied by genuine remorse for the narrative that unfairly placed responsibility where it never belonged. Let's talk about validation here, because this deserves to be said plainly and without hesitation. If you spent considerable time doubting your own perception, wondering whether you really were too much, too needy, too demanding, I want you to hear this clearly. You were responding, most likely, with completely reasonable human needs for consistency, communication, and genuine emotional presence within a relationship. The fact that these reasonable needs eventually got reframed as excessive says considerably more about the limitations of the relationship's capacity to meet them than it says about anything genuinely wrong with what you were asking for in the first place. Let's talk about what it means, practically and emotionally, when this realization occurs on their end, but you never actually receive direct acknowledgement of it. This scenario deserves careful, honest examination, because it represents perhaps the most common outcome of everything being described here. Many people experience this internal shift privately, processing it through subsequent relationships, through therapy, through quiet self-reflection, without ever circling back to explicitly tell you what they have come to understand. This absence of direct acknowledgement can feel deeply unsatisfying, robbing you of the validation you might feel you deserve after everything you endured while their narrative still held you responsible for their own limitations. Let's talk about why this absence of direct acknowledgement happens so frequently, because understanding the reasons behind it can help soften the sting of never receiving the validation you might genuinely deserve. Reaching back out specifically to acknowledge past wrongdoing requires a level of vulnerability that many avoidant individuals still struggle considerably to access, even after genuine internal growth has occurred elsewhere. It also requires confronting you directly with an admission that might feel, to them, uncomfortably exposing, reopening a chapter they might prefer to simply leave closed, rather than revisit through direct conversation. This means their private realization, however genuine, does not automatically translate into the kind of explicit apology or acknowledgement that would feel most satisfying to receive. Let's talk about what your healing actually requires, given this reality that direct acknowledgement often never arrives. Your healing cannot remain contingent on receiving external validation for something you already know to be true about your own experience. This is worth repeating clearly, because it addresses something genuinely difficult to accept. You already know you were not the problem. Your own internal experience, your own careful observation of the pattern over time, your own reasonable, human needs that got unfairly pathologized, all of this remains true and valid regardless of whether they ever explicitly confirm it. Waiting for their confirmation in order to fully believe your own truth keeps your healing dependent on something entirely outside your control. Let's talk about the specific relief available once you release this need for external confirmation, trusting instead your own accumulated evidence about what actually occurred within the relationship. This relief develops gradually through repeated practice of trusting your own perception, even without external validation, until eventually that trust becomes stable and self-sustaining, no longer requiring anyone else's agreement in order to remain firmly intact. This represents one of the most significant forms of psychological independence available within this entire healing process. Freedom from needing someone who caused you considerable pain to also become the source of your eventual validation. Let's talk about what indirect signs of this realization sometimes look like, if you happen to witness them, even without receiving direct acknowledgement. Sometimes this shows up through their behavior in subsequent relationships, visible improvements in communication or accountability that suggest genuine lessons were learned, even if those lessons never get explicitly connected back to your specific relationship in conversation with you. Sometimes it shows up through mutual connections, mentioning that they have spoken differently about the relationship's ending, taking more responsibility than they did while the relationship was actively occurring. These indirect signs, when they exist, can provide some measure of quiet satisfaction, confirmation that your perception was accurate, without requiring you to depend on this kind of secondhand information for your own sense of validation and closure. Let's talk about what happens if these indirect signs never appear at all, if there is simply no evidence, direct or indirect, that any realization has occurred on their end whatsoever. This possibility deserves equally honest acknowledgement, because sometimes, despite everything discussed throughout this conversation, genuine internal shift simply does not occur for everyone. Some people remain permanently attached to the narrative that protected them from confronting their own limitations, never developing the self-awareness required to recognize how unfairly that narrative treated their former partner. If this describes your situation, your healing still does not depend on their eventual understanding. It depends entirely on your own capacity to trust what you know to be true, regardless of whether they ever catch up to that same understanding themselves. Let's talk about what it means to release anger towards someone who may never fully understand the impact of their earlier narrative, without that release requiring you to pretend the impact was insignificant, or that you have somehow decided it did not matter. Releasing anger for your own peace does not require minimizing what actually happened. It simply means choosing not to carry that anger indefinitely, recognizing that continuing to hold it primarily affects your own present well-being, rather than producing any meaningful consequence for them. This release, when it genuinely occurs, tends to develop gradually, through considerable processing time, rather than through any single decisive moment of forced forgiveness. Let's talk about what this entire situation reveals about your own growth throughout the process of navigating it, regardless of whether they ever arrive at genuine understanding themselves. You developed the capacity to question a narrative that once felt convincing, to recognize eventually that your needs were reasonable rather than excessive, to trust your own perception, even while it was being actively challenged and undermined. This capacity represents genuine psychological growth, growth that remains entirely yours, regardless of whatever internal shift may or may not have eventually occurred within them. Your understanding that you were never the problem does not require their agreement in order to be completely, permanently true. Let's talk about what moving forward actually looks like, once you have released the need for their explicit acknowledgement, while still maintaining full confidence in your own accurate understanding of what occurred. Moving forward means continuing to trust reasonable needs for consistency, communication, and genuine presence within future relationships, refusing to preemptively minimize these needs based on a narrative that was never accurate in the first place. It means recognizing red flags more quickly in future relationships, having learned, through direct and painful experience, what unfair blame reframing actually looks and feels like from the inside. It means carrying forward genuine confidence in your own perception, confidence built through the difficult work of eventually recognizing manipulation you may not have fully understood while you were still inside it. Let's talk about the specific mental gymnastics that often occur inside an avoidant mind while the original relationship is still active, because understanding this internal process clarifies why the misattribution happens so consistently in the first place. When closeness begins triggering internal discomfort, that discomfort needs somewhere to go, some explanation that makes sense of the sudden urge to withdraw. Rather than examining internal history, which requires uncomfortable vulnerability and honest self confrontation, it becomes considerably easier, psychologically, to examine the external situation instead, searching for something about the partner or the relationship that can account for the discomfort. This search rarely comes up empty, because any relationship, examined closely enough under motivated scrutiny, will reveal something that can plausibly be framed as the cause: a tone of voice, a request for reassurance, a need expressed slightly too directly. None of these things actually caused the withdrawal. They simply provided convenient cover for a withdrawal that was already going to happen regardless. Let's talk about how this misattribution process specifically targets whatever quality in a partner happens to be most visible, or most frequently expressed. Because this explains why the accusation often feels so personally targeted, even though it rarely reflects genuine, accurate assessment. If you expressed your feelings openly, that openness likely became the target, reframed as too much emotion, too much intensity. If you asked direct questions seeking clarity, that directness likely became the target, reframed as interrogation or excessive need for reassurance. The specific accusation tends to mirror whatever coping strategy you use to manage the anxiety their inconsistency created, meaning the very tools you developed to survive the relationship's confusion often became, ironically, the exact evidence used to blame you for that same confusion. Let's talk about what it feels like, specifically, to eventually recognize this irony clearly, once sufficient distance and reflection have allowed you to see the pattern for what it actually was. There is often a strange mixture of relief and renewed frustration that accompanies this recognition. Relief at finally understanding that your coping mechanisms were reasonable responses to genuine inconsistency. Frustration at recognizing how effectively that irony obscured the truth for as long as it did. Both of these reactions are legitimate and worth acknowledging fully, rather than rushing past either one in an attempt to reach premature peace before the full recognition has been properly processed. Let's talk about the specific danger of overcorrecting once this recognition occurs, becoming so committed to the narrative that you were never the problem that any legitimate self-reflection about your own patterns becomes impossible to consider. This overcorrection deserves direct examination, because healthy self-awareness requires holding both truths simultaneously: genuine recognition that their narrative unfairly assigned you primary responsibility for their own limitations, alongside continued honest reflection about anything within your own patterns that might benefit from further growth, entirely separate from whatever blame was unfairly assigned to you previously. These two processes, releasing unfair blame and maintaining honest self-reflection, are not contradictory, and confusing them risks replacing one distorted narrative with an equally distorted opposite extreme. Let's talk about what it means to hold genuine compassion for the earlier version of yourself who spent considerable time doubting your own perception, absorbing blame that was never rightfully yours, shrinking your reasonable needs in an attempt to avoid triggering further withdrawal. This compassion deserves genuine cultivation, because that earlier version of yourself was doing the best possible navigation of a genuinely confusing, distorted situation, without access to the clarity you now possess. Speaking to that earlier self with kindness, rather than embarrassment or frustration at having believed the distorted narrative for as long as you did, represents an important part of fully integrating this entire healing process. Let's talk about the specific way this healing extends into how you evaluate potential red flags in future relationships, because having lived through this particular kind of narrative distortion tends to sharpen your perception considerably regarding similar patterns appearing elsewhere. You now recognize, through direct and painful experience, what it feels like when someone consistently reframes their own discomfort with closeness as evidence of your excessive need. This recognition, once developed, becomes a valuable protective tool, allowing you to notice this particular pattern considerably earlier in future relationships, before it has the opportunity to accumulate the same corrosive effect on your self-trust that it produced within this specific relationship. Let's talk about what genuine partnership actually requires regarding how needs get communicated and received. because holding this standard clearly protects you from ever again accepting a narrative that locates all relational difficulty within your own character. Genuine partnership involves both people taking responsibility for their own contributions to relational difficulty, rather than one person consistently absorbing blame while the other consistently deflects it. It involves curiosity rather than defensiveness when a partner expresses a need, genuine consideration of whether that need is reasonable rather than immediate reframing of the need itself as the problem. Holding this standard as your baseline expectation moving forward protects you from repeating a pattern that already cost you considerable self-trust and unnecessary self-doubt within this particular relationship. Let's talk about the specific way this misattribution often intensified during moments of genuine intimacy rather than during moments of actual conflict, because this timing detail deserves particular attention given how counterintuitive it initially seems. Many people assume blame and criticism would logically increase during disagreement, when tension is already elevated and patience already worn thin. But within avoidant dynamics specifically, criticism often intensifies precisely during moments of positive closeness, right after a vulnerable conversation, right after affection was expressed freely, right after connection felt genuinely good. This timing reveals something important about what the criticism was actually protecting against. Not genuine relational problems requiring resolution, but the vulnerability of closeness itself, requiring some justification for retreat that could be aimed outward rather than acknowledged as coming from within. Let's talk about what it means to recognize, in retrospect, that criticism arriving specifically after good moments rather than during genuinely difficult ones reveals its true function considerably more clearly than criticism arriving during actual conflict might have. This pattern, once recognized, becomes almost impossible to unsee, retroactively recoloring numerous memories that previously seemed confusing or difficult to explain. Suddenly, moments that felt like sudden, inexplicable turns from warmth to criticism make considerably more sense, understood now as a predictable defensive maneuver, rather than a mysterious, personal indictment of something genuinely wrong with how you are showing up within the relationship. Let's talk about the specific grief that accompanies this retrospective recoloring, because seeing the pattern clearly for the first time often produces its own wave of delayed grief, mourning not just the relationship itself, but also the version of events you believed for so long while still inside it. This delayed grief deserves full acknowledgement, rather than being rushed past simply because considerable time may have already passed since the relationship ended. Grief does not follow a strict timeline tied only to the initial loss. It can resurface, sometimes powerfully, whenever new understanding reveals a more accurate and often more painful picture of what actually occurred. Let's talk about what it means to eventually feel something closer to sadness for them, rather than continued anger, once the full pattern becomes clear, and once your own healing has progressed sufficiently to allow this shift in perspective. This sadness does not require excusing the impact their narrative had on you. It simply reflects genuine compassion for someone who apparently could not tolerate genuine intimacy without defensive retreat, who needed to construct an inaccurate story about their partner in order to avoid confronting considerably more uncomfortable truths about their own internal experience. This sadness, when it develops authentically rather than being forced prematurely, often represents one of the final stages of fully processing this particular kind of relational injury. Let's talk about what remains important to remember, even as this sadness or compassion develops, because compassion for their struggle should never translate into minimizing the genuine impact their behavior had on your own well-being and self-trust. It is entirely possible to feel genuine sadness for the origins of their patterns while still maintaining complete clarity that those patterns caused real harm, harm that deserved better handling than the misattribution and blame shifting you actually experienced. Holding both truths, compassion for their struggle and clarity about the genuine impact on you, without collapsing into either excessive anger or excessive excuse-making, represents mature, balanced processing of this entire situation. Let's talk about the specific way trust in future relationships gets rebuilt after this particular kind of experience. Because trust here requires deliberate, patient reconstruction, rather than assuming it will simply return automatically once sufficient time has passed. Rebuilding trust often involves consciously noticing in new relationships whether your reasonable needs get met with curiosity and consideration rather than immediate defensiveness or reframing. It involves paying close attention to whether criticism arrives proportionally, connected to genuine issues, rather than arriving unpredictably after moments of increased closeness. This deliberate attention, informed directly by lessons learned through this earlier experience, becomes a valuable tool for building genuinely healthier trust moving forward, rather than either remaining permanently guarded or naively repeating the same vulnerable patterns without any updated discernment. Let's talk about what genuine self-trust ultimately looks like once this entire healing process has progressed considerably, because self-trust here deserves its own careful description as a specific, achievable outcome. Genuine self-trust means no longer requiring external confirmation in order to know what actually happened within a difficult relationship. It means recognizing your own perception as generally reliable, even while remaining appropriately humble about specific details that might benefit from ongoing reflection. It means trusting your own emotional reactions as meaningful information, rather than immediately suspecting them of being excessive or unreasonable, simply because someone else previously characterized them that way. This self-trust, once genuinely rebuilt, becomes one of the most valuable, durable outcomes available from having survived and processed this particular kind of relational difficulty. Let's talk about what happens specifically to your own voice, your willingness to express needs directly, once this healing process has genuinely progressed, because voice deserves examination as its own significant marker of recovery. Many people, having internalized the message that their reasonable needs represented excessive demand, develop a kind of chronic self-silencing, minimizing requests before even making them, apologizing preemptively, softening legitimate concerns until they barely register as concerns at all. Recovering genuine voice means gradually relearning that stating needs clearly, without excessive qualification or apology, represents healthy communication, rather than the excessive demand it was previously mislabeled as being. Let's talk about the specific courage required to state needs plainly in a new relationship, after having previously experienced those same needs being weaponized against you as evidence of your own inadequacy. This courage develops gradually, often requiring conscious practice, sometimes uncomfortable at first, of expressing genuine needs without the anticipatory bracing for criticism that became habitual within the earlier relationship. Each successful instance of this practice, where a new partner responds with genuine consideration rather than defensiveness, provides valuable counter-evidence, gradually rebuilding the confidence that stating your needs directly represents healthy relational behavior, rather than something requiring apology or justification. Let's talk about what it means to witness a new partner respond to your needs in a genuinely different way than what you previously experienced, because this contrast, when it occurs, often produces its own significant emotional response worth acknowledging directly. There can be something almost disorienting about having a need met with genuine curiosity and care, rather than defensiveness or blame. A kind of relief mixed with lingering disbelief that this different response is actually possible and sustainable. Allowing yourself to fully receive this different treatment without constantly bracing for the other shoe to drop represents its own important step in trusting that the earlier dynamic was never the only possible outcome for how your needs could be received within relationship. Let's talk about the specific way this entire journey, from doubting your own perception to eventually trusting it fully again, tends to inform how you support others navigating similar confusion within their own relationships. Having lived through this particular kind of narrative distortion often produces genuine, hard-won wisdom worth offering to others facing similar confusion. Wisdom that carries considerably more weight coming from someone who has actually navigated this territory directly, rather than simply understanding it theoretically. This capacity to offer genuine support to others represents another valuable, unexpected outcome of everything you have processed and worked through throughout this entire experience. Let's talk one final time about what genuine freedom looks like once this entire process has been fully integrated. Freedom that extends well beyond simply this specific relationship, into your broader relationship with your own perception and your own worth. Genuine freedom means no longer requiring external validation in order to trust your own experience. It means recognizing manipulation and unfair blame reframing considerably more quickly, should it ever appear again in any future relationship. It means holding, permanently and securely, the accurate understanding that reasonable human needs for consistency, communication, and genuine presence were never at any point evidence of your own inadequacy, but simply evidence of your own healthy capacity for connection, deserving to be met by someone genuinely capable of matching that capacity in return. Let's talk about the specific way this recognition, once it settles fully within you, changes how you interpret difficult moments in any relationship moving forward. Not simply by becoming suspicious of every partner, but by developing a considerably more accurate internal compass for distinguishing genuine, reasonable feedback from unfair blame reframing dressed up as feedback. This compass develops through direct experience, rather than through simple intellectual understanding, meaning you now possess something considerably more reliable than theoretical knowledge, embodied recognition built through having survived exactly the pattern this discussion has been examining throughout. Let's talk about what it means to eventually feel genuine gratitude for your own resilience throughout this process. Gratitude that has nothing to do with the relationship itself or with anything they eventually did or did not come to understand, but everything to do with your own capacity to eventually see clearly, to eventually trust yourself again, to eventually build a life and future relationships informed by hard-won wisdom rather than continued confusion. This gratitude, directed entirely toward your own resilience and growth, represents a genuinely healthy endpoint for this particular journey, independent of any external validation or acknowledgement that may or may not ever arrive from the person whose earlier narrative caused so much unnecessary self-doubt.